I would like to welcome you to Inclusive Korea 2021. Thank you for joining us offline and online. I am Kim Mi-young and I'm the Master of Ceremony for today's event. Inclusive Korea 2021, the Moon Jae-in administration's 4-year journey, inclusive recovery, and a leap forward. Yesterday was the first day, which was held under the theme of crisis, innovation, and embracement. And today we will be holding day 2 under the theme of fairness, peace, and a leap forward. Let me introduce the first session of day 2. The topic for this session is a fair society and the government's initiatives to reform power structures. The first speaker is Professor Lee Gu-gun of Handong University, and he will give a presentation on the achievements and challenges in the reform of authority. Please greet him with a big hand.
다시 한번 인사 올리겠습니다.
Yes, once again, thank you.
귀한 자리에
I would like to take this opportunity to thank you for inviting me to give a presentation on achievements and challenges in the reform of authority. Because of the time constraint, I will try to make my presentation as concise as possible. So first of all, I will be touching upon 5 main points. First of all, I will talk about the appropriateness and the need for reform of the authority. And number 2, I will talk about how the Moon Jae-in administration for the past 4 years have pursued reform of authority and the current status. Number 3, I will take a look at the 70-year history of the Korean Constitution and how the Moon Jae-in administration's reform is taking place in what kind of historical context. And also, I will take a look at the theory of reform of criminal justice system based on republicanism. And last but not least, I will talk about the remaining tasks for fulfilling the reform of authority. So first of all, the need and appropriateness of the reform of authority. There are many reasons for pursuing this reform. But first of all is to realize the sovereignty, popular sovereignty. Korea is a democratic republic, and so we need to apply this to all sectors of our nation. Number 2 is to ensure basic human rights and also to ensure plurality in our daily lives and to ensure this through institutions. So I do believe that the most important foundation of the reform is based on this. Number 3, whatever system there is a possibility of corruption arising, and so we have to prepare for such potential corruption. And also we have to ensure that the criminal justice system remains as the last resort. Absolute power can lead to absolute corruption. That is what we have to keep in mind as we pursue the reform of authority. Number 4, the rule of law. This is one of the most important mottos of democracy. But at the same time, the legal profession can actually deteriorate the system based on the rule of law to a system that is based on the rule of man. And also throughout the constitutional history of Korea, you could see that the rule of law sometimes have deteriorated into the rule of man. So that's another reason that reform of authority is needed. Number 5, also, we have to reflect the changes in our society. There is always confrontation in our society, and so we have to respond accordingly. And also, that has to be reflected in the authority and power structures in our society. Let's take a look at the overall reform efforts carried out under the Moon Jae-in administration. So there were efforts to get rid of some undesirable points. You can say that great endeavors were carried out. As I mentioned before, I'm not saying that reform is complete. And at this moment, there are still many difficulties and challenges that we face as we pursue this reform, especially among the different institutions that hold authority. But nevertheless, I do believe that having begun this reform holds great historical significance. And so let's take a look at some of the accomplishments. First of all, there was a launch of the CIO, the Corruption Investigative Office for High-Ranking Officials. So, of course, the size of the CIO is smaller than had initially been discussed, but nevertheless, it has been launched, and the CIO is now carrying out its initial activities. For example, this launch has also led to tension rising within the prosecution. But nevertheless, we can see that not only the investigative rights, but also the rights for prosecution is being given to this organization for certain cases involving judges, prosecutors, and police officials. So now in Korea, we have a watchman's watchman system in place. Number two, there has been an adjustment to the investigative rights of the prosecution and the police. I do believe that this has led to the diversification of the investigative rights here in Korea. So the command of investigation was given to the prosecution, and the police had to follow such command. However, this has been adjusted, and the prosecution can lead the investigations. So in the future, the protocol examination of a suspect by the prosecution will be somewhat limited. And so when it comes to the investigations, the prosecution will be the role of the prosecution will face some limitations as is faced by other institutions such as the court and the judicial bodies. So, I do believe that the process of leading up to these achievements will be thoroughly researched in the future in the academic circle as well. I think that this will be studied as a model case of reforming the criminal justice authority. Number three, the Ministry of Justice has been released from the influence of prosecution, and the personnel system of the prosecution has been refurbished. I'm not sure if foreigners will actually understand what this means to have the Ministry of Justice be released from the influence of the prosecution. But in fact, in Korea, the prosecution has had great influence and authority, and so the members of the prosecution actually had dominated the Ministry of Justice in some sense in the past, and so sometimes the supervision of the Ministry of Justice over the prosecution and other institutions were in some sense meaningless. And also sometimes the prosecution was politicized in the past. And with the launch of the Moon Jae-in administration, the Minister of Justice has been appointed among those who had not served in the prosecutor's office. And also, when it comes to the institutions related to the prosecution personnel system, there has been many changes implemented. So I think that that is a major accomplishment that should be noted. Number four, the NOI, the National Office of Investigation, was implemented, and the autonomous police system was implemented as well. So the police now has investigative rights, and so there was a need to have the autonomous police separated from the duties of the regular administrative duties of the police. So, along with this, we can see that starting from July 1st, this historical change of autonomous police taking action has been carried out. Of course, there are some criticism that the autonomous police, when it comes to the substantial and actual separation from the national police, is not full. In other words, there are some weaknesses still, and so some people say that the autonomous police system has no real autonomous police station or autonomous police officers. But I do believe that we're in the initial stages, and I believe that we will be able to further develop the autonomous police system of Korea as we move forward into the future. And another accomplishment is the establishment of a human rights-based public security administration system, and also the refurbishment of a system for police dealing with intelligence affairs. In the past, I think that Korea had the culture of having fear towards the police. And as you know, President Moon Jae-in is a well-known human rights lawyer, and he well understands about how during investigative processes, the human rights of the people had been violated. And so there has been an emphasis placed on human rights of all people. And so this has been emphasized for the different institutions that we have, and has been reflected into the legal system as well. Another development is that the NIS is no longer in charge of the domestic intelligence activities. This authority has been given to the police. Some people believe that perhaps too much authority and rights has been transferred to the police. But this is another accomplishment, along with the transfer of the anti-communist investigation to the police. But today, what I would like to emphasize is the historical context of the reform of authority. I will be talking about the major events and major points. The Moon Jae-in administration tried to reform a system that is in place for 70 years. So we have to go back to the Japanese colonial rule. At that time, there was a very oppressive authority and power structure that existed. So there was the arbitrariness, the violence, the different class structure reflected into the institutions, and also the existing institutions were prone to corruption. As you well know, during the Japanese colonial period and even after being liberated, the police still tended to be pro-Japanese and also violated human rights. And so, also after liberation, the people that built the criminal justice system after liberalization, for example, Minister Lee In of the Ministry of Justice, tried to establish a judicial system that is based on statism, because of this past experience of the police force. And so all of the authorities were somewhat given to the prosecution. For example, the right to begin investigation, to supervise investigation, to conclude investigation, to the right to request for a warrant, the right to seek prosecution and maintain it, were all given to the prosecution. However, the statism-based reform was carried out, but in order to be completed, this kind of reform to be flawless, what was needed was for the 150 prosecutors to also hold perfect integrity. And represent fairness, but I think that this was something difficult to accomplish. As you know, after the 1950s, if you look at the criminal justice system, you could see that rather than completing the reform based on statism, there were some fallbacks. And for example, I could see that there were strengthened ideological confrontations between South Korea and North Korea, and also the military government came into power, and so there were some power structures and authority that came into place that held rights that were untouchable in some sense and had extraterritoriality. And also, sometimes we could see that there were some irregularities popping up, and so at that time, if the prosecution played its role in the right manner, then the prosecution should have fought against the abuse of power that was shown during the 1960s, for example. And if so, then I do believe that the prosecution and the criminal justice system would have received the support of the people. But unfortunately, starting especially from the late 1960s, the prosecution started to go in a different direction. For example, the Minister of Justice, Shin Jik-soo, and the system leaders, well, they try to protect and continue the criminal justice system and the power structure as is, rather than pursuing reform. And the lawyers, the legal professions that later went into the prosecution, and also those who took the bar exam and became prosecutors, well, what happened was that after they retired from the prosecution, they would work as lawyers, and they were granted privileges for the former posts that they held as part of the prosecution. So you can see that these practices actually show that reform was no longer being pursued in full-fledged. And also, we do have a proud history in Korea pursuing democratization. But in this process, when you look at the criminal justice system, well, there was a reform and revision of the Constitution in 1987. But this revision of 1987 actually made the legal system go back to the past. Because if you look at the 1987 system, well, it kind of returns everything before the military coup back to the 1960s. And so it actually means a return to a system in the past, and the prosecution that are so used to being granted privileges of former posts. Well, the prosecution actually was placed at the peak of authority, at the most highest position of the power structure. During those days, well, the prosecution was in charge of prosecuting the former presidents Chun Doo-hwan and Roh Tae-woo, and they were saying that a successful coup cannot be punished, but then 2 months later, they were pushing for the revision of the law so that the past presidents could be penalized and trialed. And I think that this kind of a development actually helped further strengthen the authority of the prosecution. In the past, actually, there was not a lot of special investigations carried out by the prosecution. But starting from the late 1980s, especially after the declaration of a war against crime in 1989, you can see that the Supreme Prosecutor's Office started to carry out these special investigations. And so the prosecutors that were good at investigations were viewed to be very capable and competent prosecutors. And there were some political figures, politicians, who could deal with their challenges through the legislative branch, but rather turn to the criminal justice system to deal with their challenges or problems. So, as I mentioned before, you could see that the rule of law was moving towards a rule of man. And so the legal professions were leading this transformation from a system based on the rule of law to the rule of man. And that sparked demands and calls for reform of prosecution. So now let's take a look at the reform efforts under the Moon Jae-in administration. Actually, I do believe that the prosecution itself could have initiated the reform. The prosecutions could have reviewed themselves and pursue integrity, show courage and boldness to move away from the past unlawful practices or past unwanted practices. But the prosecution, as you probably well know, did not actually push to self-reform themselves. So the prosecution continued to grow in terms of the authority and the power that it holds. And also, there were many different groups within the prosecution. There were different factions within the prosecution. And so, the reform of the prosecution now was being pursued by those who favored liberalism or a liberalism-based reform. The Ministry of Justice, who pursued the reform of authority, were mainly from the academic circle. There were professors of law. They understood well about the principles of liberalism and liberalism-based reform. And the liberalism-based reform emphasizes the upholding of human rights of the defendants, the suspects, and the victims. The Korean people have a long negative sentiment towards the prosecution because of past experiences and historical experiences. And I think that because of this, it might have been easier to pursue a reform based on liberalism. And as I mentioned, the prosecution tended to have the tendency to be prone to corruption, for example, or to have a sense of violence or arbitrariness or reflect class structure. And this was revealed during the push for liberalism-based reform. And the neglect for the victims of the criminal cases and also the loss of capacity to heal and solve problems through the criminal justice system and also the criminal justice system centered around legal professions, and the weakening of the social consensus to build a better society. I think that what I just mentioned is actually, however, the limitation of the discourse surrounding the liberalism-based reform. So the liberalism-based reform was not enough, in my view, to complete the reform of authority. The Moon Jae-in administration, when it came into power, was at a position to have to eradicate the deep-rooted evils in our society. And when the administration came into power, it was a time when the prosecution held very great authority and power. The prosecution led the way in putting the two past presidents on trial. But right before the inauguration of the Moon Jae-in administration, there was the scandal surrounding the former president, and at that time there was great distrust created towards the judicial branch. And so, as you know, right before the general election in April of 2020, as I mentioned before, the many problems of the criminal justice system were fully surfaced and revealed, and a full-fledged push for the reform of authority was implemented. What you see here was a quote by the president during a meeting held by the president in October of 2019. I will not read this, but it seems to imply that a vision is needed to carry out and fulfill the reform of authority. So because of the time constraint, I will now go into some of the tasks that should be pursued. Now, republicanism, I would like to talk about the reform of authority based on republicanism as an alternative. I think that the core of republicanism is fulfilling and realizing freedom through political participation, pursuing public good, and authority and power can be maintained and upheld in the right manner when there is the rule of law being upheld and when there are checks and balances appropriately put into place. And so the checks and balances by the citizens is important. And the participation of the citizens is quite important. So I think that that is a core of the republicanism-based reform of authority. So for example, the victims, the suspects, the plaintiffs, or the legal professions, the investigators, everyone actually should be recognized as citizens on an equal footing. And whose freedom has been violated. And so the criminal justice process should be a process for restoring the degraded freedom. I think that that kind of a consensus is what can be reached through the republicanism-based reform of authority. So all of the participants are recognized as equal citizens on an equal footing. So in short, I think that the process would be a process of learning by the citizens So if there is wrongdoing, then this would be corrected. And not only the perpetrators, but also everyone in the society would be able to go towards a better state through this process. And so the constitutional value would be fundamentally realized through this learning process. I think that that kind of learning process is required. And so I think that for about the past year or so, there has been a number of incidents that has been hurting our society. And I think that it makes it difficult for us to look at the reform issue from a republicanism perspective, unfortunately. And the former head of prosecution, unfortunately, has declared that he will run for president. So these types of developments are making it difficult to look at the reform of authority from a republicanism perspective. But I would like to emphasize that this is actually a learning process and a process for restructuring our community to make our community and society a better place. So, to realize the rule of law, the legal profession's dominance has to be continuously monitored and kept in check, because the legal professions have the potential of transforming the rule of law into the rule of man. So there has to be continuous attention paid to the legal professions and keeping them in check. And also, it is very important to secure the checks by the citizens. It's not just about the citizens talking about issues on YouTube, but actually there has to be policy, imagination, and political efforts or checks by the citizens on the political issues as well. So last but not least, I would like to mention that now we have the polarization or the diversification of the investigative rights. And so what is needed at this moment is that we need to specialize factual judgments. So investigation actually, before making a legal judgment, it has to be based on factual judgment. And so there has to be effective separation of the factual judgment from the legal judgment. And based on this, the factual judgment should be carried out by the investigators who have the professional capacity. In the past, everything was done by the prosecution, but now we have the diversification of investigative rights, and so accordingly, we need a new governance structure. So then, what is needed at this point is the specialization of the investigative bodies and organizations. So now there has to be detailed segregation or division of in terms of determining the areas that one would investigate based on one's expertise. So we need the specialization of the investigative bodies and agencies. Right now, we have the Special Judicial Police, but this system is not working that well. And so I do believe that what we need is to further sophisticate the investigative system and bodies. Of course, we will have to think deeper into how we are going to have these different investigative bodies be in charge of different fields, but professionalism and specialization is indeed needed, and also at the same time we have to foster the investigators with expertise in particular fields.
세 번째는 형사소송 과정에서
And also,
자치를 강화할 수 있는 방안을
there has to be ways to strengthen the autonomy of the citizens in the criminal justice system. So, in the criminal justice process, the citizens' autonomy has to be strengthened. For example, we can establish a police committee at the city and provincial level and have the citizens participate, or we can have the chief prosecutor being directly elected by the people. And also, there might be a need to reform and revise the constitution. And we also have to look at the criminal justice ecosystem and make sure that there is a balance of micropower.
욕설이라든지 반행이라든지 이런저런 문화적인 헤게모니 속에서
Now,
대단히 많습니다.
we can see
이 부분과 관련해서
that
피의자 피고인만이 아니라
not only the suspects and the defendants, but also the victims, their procedural rights and also their self-defense rights have to be ensured. And so I think that the public defender system should be extended to the victims as well. We also have to innovate and reform the culture of the criminal justice organizations. And also we have to get rid of the legal professions being granted preferential treatment for their past positions that they had held. And also, I think that there might be a need to have the cost for the criminal justice system to be in the public realm. So with this, I would like to conclude my presentation. Thank you for your attention. Yes, thank you very much. We just heard a presentation by Professor Lee Gu-gun, and he talked about the achievements and challenges in the reform of authority.
Let us go on to the second presentation of the day. This will be by Executive Director Yoo Han-bum of Transparency International Korea, titled Anti-Corruption: Realization of a Society that Upholds Integrity. Pleased to meet you. As have been introduced, I am Yoo Han-bum, Executive Director of Transparency International Korea. My title today is Anti-Corruption: Realization of a Society that Upholds Integrity. I will be speaking for about 20 minutes. I will be speaking in the following order. I will be covering item number 2 on the national agenda related to anti-corruption. And in the 19th presidential election, we have had anti-corruption policy requests by civic society. Let's take a look at what kind of requests were made. Then let's take a look at the advancement of the item number 2 on the agenda. Let's also take a look at the effect of this agenda item, as well as some implications and tasks for the future. So agenda item number 2 was related to anti-corruption. As you're well aware, during the Park Geun-hye administration, there was the Park Geun-hye Choi Soon-sil gate, and it was a corruption scandal. And so the president was impeached, and a new government was launched. And so one of the most important item on the national agenda was anti-corruption and to create a new Korea. That was one of the most important items on the national agenda. We had to make sure that the public could not use corruption to create personal interest for themselves. And so correcting that abnormality was the most important item on the national agenda for the future development of Korea. The current government was launched in 2017, and when announcing 100 items on the national agenda, number 2 was anti-corruption and civil rights And if we take a look at the contents, they established a system for anti-corruption. First, there was the anti-corruption consultative body that was established by the Nomuyan administration, but that was discontinued, was reinstated. And the Korea Corruption and Civil Rights Commission actually separated the anti-corruption function as the Korea Independent Commission Against Corruption. That was one of the items for this agenda item. And the introduction of whistleblower protection as well as the People's Litigation System was also mentioned. There was also the stronger punishment for the 5 major crimes of corruption, as well as coming up with a public-private partnership to establish a transparent Korea, and another commission to introduce the public interest into the government agenda through participatory democracy. And one of the goals, quantitative goals, was to make it into the top 20 in terms of CPI. We wanted to have a holistic approach to anti-corruption by establishing relevant laws, and so this comprehensive approach would also include a consultative body. Anti-corruption would not be pursued by the government alone, but it would be pursued by various stakeholders. And 2 principles were kept in sight in order to continue this approach. For your reference, during the 2017 presidential election, there were 12 policy tasks suggested by the civic society. The Citizens Coalition for Economic Justice, People's Solidarity for Participatory Democracy, Transparency International Korea, and 2 other organizations have conducted anti-corruption campaigns together for about 20 years. And so we actually got together to announce the 12 major policy tasks for anti-corruption, and this suggestion was introduced to all of the candidates. The first one was that the new president should announce his or her determination for anti-corruption. Second, that we need to reinstate the anti-corruption consultative body. Third, a dedicated organization for anti-corruption needs to be independent under the president, and we need the Corruption Investigation Office for high-ranking officials. We also need to reinstate a cooperative partnership for the citizen audit, corporate inspection, and sustainable anti-corruption culture. We also needed to expand the accounting reviews and civic audits. We also need to disclose the minutes of the meetings by the Blue House Cabinet and the States Affairs Committee. We need to have a system to protect whistleblowers. We also need to strengthen anti-corruption education within society and schools so that we could have integrity education infrastructure. We also need to establish a legal foundation for the separation of economy and politics. We also need to strengthen punishment for those who participate in abnormal practices, and we also need to establish the Conflict of Interest Act. Of course, the civic groups that participated in these suggestions did not take a look at how much of these suggestions were achieved, but there is a consensus that much of these suggestions were put into action. But there are aspects, for example, moving the audit function into the National Assembly that has not been executed yet. And so later on, we will take a look at these 12 suggestions and take a look at how much of it is executed, and then we will come up with a new list of suggestions for the next government. So let's take a look at how much of an advancement we have actually seen through this government. The current government has various conflicting evaluations on anti-corruption, but because the Anti-Corruption and Civil Rights Commission is the main government body, I will take a look at the information from the Commission to base my evaluations on. First, establishing a cross-governmental anti-corruption system. Let's take a look at this factor. Efforts have been made to create a comprehensive anti-corruption organization. There was a separation of the administrative trial function, and also there was an effort to strengthen the investigation function so that the Anti-Corruption Civil Rights Commission could have investigation rights. The law was tabled for the 20th National Assembly. It was not passed. And so there were much efforts to strengthen anti-corruption functions, but laws were not enacted to separate the administrative trial function and also to have a legal foundation for the Anti-Corruption and Civil Rights Commission. We also have established a strong anti-corruption reform momentum, and in September of 2017, a presidential body was organized with the participation of various relevant ministries. And consultation continues to today. We also have seen the establishment and execution of an anti-corruption roadmap for the public sector and the private sector. In 2018, the 5-year anti-corruption comprehensive plan was declared and put into place. The laws related to the actions of public officials was reformed, and there was also the corruption related to hiring at public organizations, and so there was reforms to improve the hiring and recruiting procedures of public organizations. And in order to make sure that we eliminate corruption within the everyday lives of the people, we have come up with a consultative body to decide on 9 tasks to eliminate corruption in our everyday lives, including indigenous corruption, bribery, and deep-rooted evils. We are also working on the Whistleblowers Protection Act. When this government was launched, we talked about how we need to have specific laws to protect whistleblowers. There were 279 laws to protect whistleblowers, but as of April of 2021, the number was expanded to 471. And if the whistleblowers would report under their own name, we also introduced a system where whistleblowers could report under an alias. And we have had reforms on the laws to compensate and protect whistleblowers. There was a law tabled for people's litigation, but the law has not been passed yet. Concerning the 5 major corruption crimes, there were much efforts that were made. Bribery, acceptance of bribery for mediation, acceptance of bribery through goods office, and breach of trust and embezzlement are the 5 major corruption crimes that have strong punishment. And for politicians, entrepreneurs, public officials, they are not open for presidential pardons. We are also in the process of establishing a public-private consultative council for a transparent society. A monitoring group was launched in March of 2018, and this organization is created to facilitate the active participation of the people in anti-corruption policies. So it's not just about the leaders of our society deciding the measures, but we have 30 representatives from all corners of our society participating in this group to work on major anti-corruption issues. When we came up with the 5-year comprehensive anti-corruption plan, we had the participation of the Public-Private Consultative Council for Transparent Society join in for coming up with the plan. We are also working on establishing a citizen public interest committee to strengthen the public interest and transparency of public organizations. I don't believe that the results are tangible yet. As you're well aware, the Conflict of Interest Act was passed in April of this year, and so this actually prohibits the pursuit of private interest while conducting work by public officials so that we can actually win the trust of the people for the public offices. As you're well aware, this law was a part of the Kim Young-nan Act, and so it was a part of that act from 2011, but this part was missing from the act, and so this part was added as a separate law under the name of the Conflict of Interest Law. As you're well aware, the bill was tabled for a long time, but the LH incident actually became a turning point for this law to be passed by the National Assembly. This law includes parts of whistleblowing, as well as the prohibition to utilize various confidential information acquired in office. And so we're not striving to become a society that does not give or take bribes, but we are looking to eliminate all sorts of corruption. Most of the corruption in Korea are elite cartel-styled corruption. And so it is about using corruption through this elite cartel rather than giving and taking bribes. And so we have a law that covers a wider portfolio of acts of corruption. This includes all aspects, including conflict of interest. And so this is the institutionalization of eliminating the type of corruption that have always existed within our society. And so we need to make sure that the Kim Young-nan Act and the Conflict of Interest Act takes root within our society. And thanks to these efforts, we have seen the following results. According to the CPI announced by Transparency International each year, here you can see the change in the score for Korea. As you can see in the graph, in 2017, we were ranked 52 out of about 180 countries. But with the inauguration of the Moon Jae-in administration, you can see the ranking going up to 51, 45, 39, and 33. And you can see that we have achieved the highest ever score of 61 out of 100. If you take a look at this chart, you can see that in 2008 and 2009, we were at number 39. But during the last 10 years, the scores have either stagnated or fallen. But with the inauguration of the Moon Jae-in administration, thanks to various anti-corruption policies, we have been able to climb 19 ranks to achieve number 33. And if we take a look at the percentage of people who believe that Korea has become more transparent, that percentage is 43% compared to the 26% of 2017. And this is a question addressed to the people of Korea. Transparency International will ask the people of a specific country called Corruption Barometer to ask them if they feel like their country has become more transparent. And you can see that the percentage of people who believe that they need to provide money or goods to public officials has dropped. And you can see that the percentage of people who experience corruption has fallen to 0.4%. Concerning whistleblower protection, you can see that the number of protection cases has gone up, and compensation for the whistleblowers has also increased. Last, I would like to provide you with some implications and some tasks ahead. As you have seen, the government has made great efforts for anti-corruption, and there has been enhanced interest of the people of Korea for a transparent public society. And so we can see that transparency has increased by quite a significant amount in the last 4 years. The reorganization of the Anti-Corruption and Civic Rights Commission, the People's Litigation System, as well as various legislative efforts have not been as fast as we would like to have seen it because the enactment of the relevant laws did not happen very quickly. As we have seen in the Conflict of Interest Act, we can see that laws are usually passed when there is a big incident like the LH incident. And so we would need a proactive stance of the political circle in order to pursue anti-corruption efforts. We need to also make sure that the anti-corruption policies are expanded from the public sector into the private sector across the society. In order to do this, we will need to have a voluntary anti-corruption campaign as well as the expansion of the anti-corruption campaign and culture through public-private partnership led by the private sector. It seems that I have 40 more seconds, and so let me use those 40 seconds. Personally, what I would like to see is, I'm sure that you remember this, all governments, when they are first inaugurated, then they start with a strong determination to build a strong nation through anti-corruption. But without exception, when we go towards the end of their term, each government is then full of various corruption scandals related to those who are close to those in power. And so we have always seen this without exception. It seems that the term for the current government is about 10 months in remaining. The presidential election is just 8 months away. We have yet to see decisive corruption scandals within this government, but I hope that you will be able to tighten your reins and make sure that we continue to finish strong in terms of anti-corruption efforts. And I look forward to the first Korean government without any corruption scandals being born through this government. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Executive Director Yoo Han-bum. Your presentation on anti-corruption and realization of society and that upholds integrity was presented.
Let's go on to the last presentation, which will be given by Dr. Kim Yoon-jung, a team leader of the Korea Legislation Research Institute. She will talk about the promotion of fair economy and democratization of the market. Please greet her with a big hand. Yes, good morning. I am Kim Yoon-jung from the Korean Institute from the Korea Legislation Research Institute. I'm also the member of the Presidential Commission on Policy Planning. Now, when I was first placed into the PCPP, I thought about why as an expert of competition law was I placed in here. But I thought that competition can help promote sustainable development, and I realized that was why I was asked to join the BCPP. Today I will be talking about promotion of the fair economy and democratization of the market. Now, in every government, I think that fair competition has always been emphasized, but during the Moon Jae-in administration, there has been much accomplishments in terms of reforming the law and also implementing new institutions. So I have prepared my presentation as follows, and let's take a look first at the inclusive growth and fair economy. So first, I think we have to take a look at a fair economic order. According to the Fair Trade Act, Article 1, fairness is about being fair and right without being biased to any side. And also, the prevention of concentration of economic power, regulating abuse of market-dominant positions, and regulating unfair trade practices are emphasized. Now, when we talk about competition, we talk about horizontal relations, and transaction talks about vertical relationships. And we need fairness in all of these relations. And also, inclusive growth has a close relationship with fair economy, because in a fair economy, inclusive growth can be realized by having benefits provided to more people in our society. In a vertical relationship, we can eradicate the abuse of power and higher status. And also, the economic actors can have the belief and trust that if they work harder, then they can win greater benefits. So this serves as an incentive for greater activities carried out by the participants of the economy. And so that becomes the foundation for an inclusive growth. So more specifically, let's take a look at, first of all, the prevention of economic concentration and also restoration of democracy of the market. Now, when we talk about concentration, we talk about the market concentration, general concentration, and possession concentration. We usually talk about the concentration in terms of the general concentration and the possession concentration. So general concentration is about certain companies or certain corporate groups accounting for more of the overall resources of the nation's economy. And possession concentration talks about certain individuals or family members possessing a great percentage of economic resources. A good case in point in Korea would be the conglomerates. So here, this is a graph of the increase of the number of affiliates of the major business groups. And this is the data from KDI. And so this shows the contribution of the resource distribution efficiency of the independent corporations compared to those of the corporate group. So you can see that the dotted line is lower than the straight line before 2010. Well, people ask, is Korea the only country that is actually regulating the conglomerates? But we can see this in Japan and also in Israel as well. So in the case of Japan, we can see that there are regulations as seen on the screen. This is the Monopoly Prohibition Act. And this is viewed to be a quite meaningful stipulation, Article 9. Due to economic concentration, the overall gap in terms of general business capabilities have widened, and therefore, this regulation is needed to prevent such economic concentration. In the case of Israel in 2012, the large corporations were dissolved, and the legal basis for this was that the large corporation groups, well, they have large bargaining power, and so they can actually influence the institution to become more beneficial towards their side. And that's why Israel had called for the dissolution or breakdown of these large business groups. In the US, there was an antitrust law which started with the concern over concentration in economic power. And also, Article 7 of the Clayton Law of 1950 was reformed so that the small numbers of corporations having dominant positions in the economic order or in the economy can be eradicated so that the damage to democratic systems and institutions can be prevented. Now, there was a reform and revision of the Fair Trade Act. But today I'm going to look and focus at the more in the institutional reforms. First of all, if you look at the reform of the FTC, Fair Trade Act, you can see that the required equity ratio for the subsidiaries and the second-tier subsidiaries have been increased. And also, there has been limitations placed on the voting rights of financial companies or companies in the insurance business. And this has led to greater accountability. Also, another issue that is closely connected to the concentration of economic power is the undue benefits enjoyed by conglomerates. So this is actually regulations similar to the prohibition regulation for unlawful support. So this actually is to regulate support that can be given to certain individuals or groups for succession of power within the corporations. But actually, it was very difficult to regulate this and prove the unlawfulness. And so there was a revision to this. And so the regulation now focused on the concentration of economic power. And this prohibits the undue benefits to related parties. Now, these are still quite similar with unlawful support, the unlawful support prevention regulation. So, for example, if you inherit a company, then that would lead a lot of inheritance tax. And so, but on the other hand, if you inherit a company that is not listed, but is not that large in scale, then you would not pay a lot of inheritance tax. And so you would inherit this small company, and then after that there would be intra-group trading, which would lead to this new company growing without the successor or the one who has inherited the company not having to pay a lot of tax. So new regulations have been put into place to prevent this. And also, there is regulations to prevent the cross-ownership of affiliates so that the large corporations and related parties cannot hold ownership of the companies without putting in a lot of capital investment. So this is another strong regulation against the large corporations. In the case of Japan also, we can see that there were these irregular practices that hurt the SMEs enter into the market. And in Korea also, you can see that within corporations of Korea, you can see that a number of affiliates were given to the sons and daughters of the leaders of the conglomerates, the owner families. And the companies run by the sons and daughters would receive a lot of work from these large corporations. So this type of undue benefits are prevented through the revision. The existing regulation actually to prevent the undue benefits enjoyed by the conglomerates was first put into place during the time of the Park Geun-hye administration. But actually, if you look at the percentage of the required equity ratio, it has been increased. And in the past, actually, the related persons, in the case of listed companies, 30%, and non-listed companies, 20% or more of shares held by an affiliate can be subject to this regulation. But there was a revision of this, and there was some change so that there can be stronger regulations. And also, we can see that in the past, there was no way to actually take away the undue benefits that was enjoyed by the conglomerates. But actually, the affiliate companies can be subject to a lawsuit with the change of the law, which is known as a multi-representative litigation system. Next, I would like to talk about the subcontractor and the contractor relationship. I think that everyone knows a lot about these incidents. It's a really well-known unfair practice in the Korean economy. But actually, not only the subcontractor and the contractor relationship, but also transactions that hurt fairness and fair competition exist. Now, if we look at the unfairness in the transaction contents, we can see that there is abuse of advantageous or superior status involved. So, when there is a transaction and there is abuse of power or status, then this is actually an act of exploiting the economic weak, and it hurts the self-development of the party involved in the transaction, and it undermines the basis for fair trade. But actually, this was further developed with a special act, and so there is a Subcontractor Act, a Franchise Business Act, a Large-Scale Distribution Act, and an Agency Act under the Subcontractor Relationship Act. And also, the Online Platform Act actually has been submitted to the National Assembly, but it's not been officially passed, and so I just noted down these 4 acts. But here you can see that there are similar phrases, that is to ensure that the companies, the entities are at an equal footing, and that they are mutually beneficial and complementary so that there can be balanced development enjoyed. Right now, you can see that the entities, in terms of the subcontractors and the contractors, they are not on an equal footing, but rather the contractors are exploiting the more economically weak subcontractors. So these new laws have been implemented, as can be seen here. And if you look at the Large Distribution Business Act, this is about the hypermarkets and also the stores that are within the hypermarkets, or the online businesses, for example, Coupang, actually falls under this law. And also the Namyeong Dairy Company scandal contributed to the establishment of this law. In terms of the Subcontractor Act, there has been many reforms, but for example, the payment to subcontractors were promoted, and also unjust interference into management was prohibited, and also the unit price of the parts by SMEs have been ensured to receive a fair price, and also there is a penalty point system that has been revised so that if the damage relief is carried out, then the penalty points can be decreased. And also there was a revision to the fines. Now, also there has been a revision to help those who are starting businesses, for example, to provide them with more accurate startup-related information. And especially in terms of the franchise business, there has been a voluntary rule that has been approved and implemented. In the past, there were some unfair practices that the franchise stores had to bear and burden, but these have been revised through the new laws. And sometimes the franchise stores, they suffer difficulty because their business is not doing well, and they want to stop their franchise business, but they have to pay a penalty for not fulfilling their contract. So that part actually has been revised as well. The voluntary rules, well, this was approved in December of 2018, and also for example, if there is a franchise business, kimbap business, for example, there can be some supplies and, for example, chopsticks that are provided to the franchise stores, but they might be provided at an excessive price. So the unit price has to be transparently released and made public. For the subcontractor and the contractor regulation, the franchise agencies' dispute resolution and mediation function has been transferred to the city and provincial level, and we can see that the mediation has been taking place in areas such as Seoul, Incheon, Gyeonggi, and Busan. And next is the complaints and the damage relief for individuals. In the past, a lawsuit had to be raised and the complaint has to be raised through the FTC. If the FTC believes that there is no fault with the businesses, then there is nothing that the individuals could do. And so this was dealt with through the revision and implementation of new institutions. For example, there can be a lawsuit raised for damage relief, but this was difficult to do by individuals. It was difficult to prove or provide evidence of the damage that was incurred upon them. And so there was a need to rectify this. And so, rather than going through the FTC, a new policy has been, or system has been put into place for direct complaints being raised by the individuals to the businesses. And also the businesses now has the duty to submit the evidence and the documentations. So the burden of proof is now placed on the businesses, and even after the implementation of this new system, it is still difficult for individuals to receive damage relief. And so, if it is difficult to be compensated for the damages, there is an additional process through the FTC to make sure that the damages are compensated. And so, this is the efforts under the Moon Jae-in administration to promote fair competition. Thank you very much. Yes, we have just heard from Dr. Kim Yoon-jung. Thank you very much. And now let us go into the panel discussion.
We will be inviting the three presenters as well as Mr. Han In-seop, the president of the Korean Institute of Criminology and Justice, as the moderator. We also have with us Research Fellow Kim Dae-gun of the Korea Institute of Criminology and Justice, Director Lee Eun-jung of the Graduate School of East Asian Studies at Free University of Berlin, Professor Kim Jong-chul of Yonsei University, Professor Vladimir Tynofov of University of Oslo, Professor Yoo Dong-min of Chungnam National University, and Fellow Lee Hwa-ryung of KDI. This session will be moderated by President Han In-seop of the Korea Institute of Criminology and Justice. President Han is currently a professor at the the law school of the university, Seoul National University. We will now begin our discussion session. From 9:30 in the morning until now, we have started day 2 titled Fairness, Peace, and a Leap Forward, and we have heard 3 presentations. We have heard about the reform of authority, anti-corruption, as well as fair economy. We have listened to the 4 years and 2 months of achievement by the Moon Jae-in administration. We took a look at institutionalization legislation concerning these 3 topics. And it seems that each of us knew only our areas of expertise, but when we take a look at these 3 domains together, we have seen great achievements. Of course, there are still shortcomings, but we have been able to take leaps forward. And if we take a look at the 100 items on the national agenda, we could take a look at this list again and again, and we can see how we are on the way to achieving each item on the list. We have had 3 great presentations, and now we will be inviting 6 discussants. The available time for us is until 12 noon. I've heard that we can have until 12 noon. We need to end 12 o'clock on the dot, and possibly it would be better if we could end at 11:50. We hope that the discussants will keep this in mind. I am sure each discussant has much to say, but discussion means that we will be interacting, and so it will not just be a presentation. So we will proceed in the following manner. We will be giving 5 minutes to each of the discussants, and so I will stop you at 5 minutes. So please keep your statement to 5 minutes, and please make sure that you jump to the point. And then we will have some time available for interactions between the discussants and the speakers. So we shall proceed in that manner. We will first start with Research Fellow Kim Dae-gun of the Korea Institute of Criminology and Justice.
안녕하십니까?
Yes, as was just introduced, I am from Korean Institute of Criminology and Justice. My name is Kim Dae-gun. And reform of authority has long been a request of our civil society and is still an ongoing project. It's a bit disappointing, but I'm glad that the efforts made in the past for reform have come to fruition. Minerva's owl spreads its wings only at dusk, and I think it's time to consider the new direction for reform through careful review and reflection on the efforts and achievements so far, and to present the prospects of a democratic rule of law to ensure citizens' human rights and fundamental rights more firmly. So today, we are here for the session that looks into a fair society and the government's initiatives to reform power structures. And the presenter looked at the historical context and the justification, the need, and also the future challenges for the reform, and in quite long detail, and also talks about the republicanism-based reform. If I may summarize the presentation, it talks about how authority can be prone to corrupt, and so there is a need to keep a check on authority. And not only that, he talks about how after 1987 there has been a need to reflect the changes in our society into our institutions and the criminal justice system as well. So he talks about the challenges that we have to overcome. He talks about the achievements of the reform. He talks about the historical context and the future direction for the reform. So there are many points that I would like to summarize about the presentation, but because of the time constraint, I would like to focus on the questions that I would like to raise to the speaker. Now, I think that the analysis was quite timely and appropriate, and I do agree with what was mentioned by the presenter, but in order to engage in a productive discussion, I would like to ask a number of questions to the professor. First of all, if you look at the presentation, he talks about the liberalism-based reform, and however, if you look at the discourse of liberalism-based reform, there has been a number of weaknesses, and there were some limitations to fulfill and complete the reform. And as an alternative, the republicanism-based reform has been emphasized. However, if you look at the discourse of republicanism and also the neo-republicanism discourse, we can see that the discourse of republicanism actually has not been substantially reflected or transferred into an actual institution, political institution. So also, I am curious whether the republicanism-based reform is significantly and fundamentally different from the liberalism-based reform. So I would like to ask, what is the specific aspects of the republicanism-based reform that you would like to emphasize? And number two, I agree with what was mentioned about the separation of the factual judgment and the legal judgment and the new government that was mentioned. I think that this is a very persuasive direction for our society. But actually, I'm curious whether it is possible to clearly separate the factual judgment and the legal judgment. There has been a lot of talk about this, and also I do agree with the diversification, the decentralization of the investigative rights and power, but actually, when we think about the specialization of investigation, perhaps this specialization might be hurt because of too much decentralization. So I would like to ask your opinion about this. And also, the supplementary investigation supervisory right given to the Ministry of Justice can have many benefits, but at the same time, it could be a window of intervention into political affairs. So I would like to ask your opinion on this as well. And number three, now the reform of the prosecution has been at the core of the criminal justice system reform. And so the prosecution is given to the prosecutors, whereas the investigation will be carried out by the police. I understand that that is at the core of this reform. But I think that what would be the essential and basic role of the prosecution? Now, the prosecution still have some remaining rights about investigations, and also they also can help in terms of supplementing the conclusion of investigation by the police. So I think that, personally, there has to be a consistent principle applied to the separation of prosecution and investigation. So what is the exact role that should be taken on by the prosecution in terms of prosecution, maintaining the public prosecution, and also in terms of supervising the human rights in investigations by the police? And also, well, in the presentation, we talked about the historical context and the process of the criminal justice reform, and the recent scandals before the Moon Jae-in administration led to greater distrust for the judicial system as well. So I think that also, if you look at the military courts, there is great unfairness sometimes that can be found. So I would like to ask you also, what do you think should be the direction for the reform of the judicial branch? I think that we are at a time when we have to continuously discuss about the reform of authority, and I do hope that we can engage in active discussion on this topic today. Thank you very much. Yes, thank you. So I gave you only 5 minutes, and that's why I think that he was speaking very fast. I think he's out of breath. But because you have kept time, we will have more time for discussion. And next, let's go on to Dr. Lee Eun-jung from the Berlin University. The Free University of Berlin. I thought that she would join us online, but she's here in person, so thank you very much. I will give you 5 minutes and maybe plus 1 or 2 more. Thank you. Please go ahead. Yes, thank you very much. I am Ian Jung from the Free University of Berlin. I think I'm not a professional or an expert to talk about the Reform Authority because my major is not law. But I have seen how the authority was reformed in Germany as Germany was unified. And I think that because of my experience of seeing what happened in Germany, I was invited. So I think that as a non-expert and a person without expertise in the legal profession, still I can provide a fresh perspective, and that is why I have been invited. So, time is flying. One thing I would like to mention is that, including the presentation, but if you look at the reform of the authority ongoing in Korea, what I felt was that every authority and power is prone to corruption. Not only absolute power, but all power and authority is prone to corruption, and that is why there has to be continuous checks placed on authority, and reform is needed. So when we talk about the process of reform, I think that we seem to focus only on the institutions. However, we need continuous checks on authority and power, but it's not just about checks on the institutions. So today it has been emphasized on numerous occasions how the rule of law has turned into the rule of man. But if we focus only on the institutions, but sometimes we neglect the important part of focusing on the people aspect. So we have to keep that in mind. And also, when we talk about reform, we have to focus on the limitations of meritocracy. So those who have passed an exam has been placed in positions of power and authority. So then what is the level of justification for such authority, and how are we going to verify the level of justification of authority? I think that this is something that is being discussed throughout the world. In Germany, those who have been elected into positions of authority, well, the justification for such authority, I think, is discussed in the perspective of the politicization of the judicialization of politics. And so it's a little different, it's a little bit of a different perspective from what is emphasized here in Korea. But I think that with the judicialization of politics, the need for verifying the expertise of the legal profession is being recognized. So in the Constitution Court of Germany, well, all issues, including reforming family structures, are being reviewed by the judges in the Constitution Court. And so there has been an issue raised about how are we going to verify the expertise of the judges in the Constitutional Court. And also, the participation of citizens in the criminal justice system, I think this can be viewed in a positive light. But if you're going to directly elect the chief prosecutor and have the citizens participate in that way, then how are you going to ensure the expertise or the specialization? So this becomes a very complicated matter. The people who are participating, the qualification of them, of the participants, and also the expertise of the participants, there has to be another institution to verify that. So once you have a certain system or an institution in place, you have to continuously supplement it with new measures or new plans. We are talking about reform, and I think that we tend to think that reform ends with a single reform. But actually, after we conclude a reform, that is actually the preparatory stage for another reform. And so in that sense, I think that once the reform that is ongoing is concluded, still, we have to continuously make efforts for improvements. And these improvements have to go on and continue. So I think that that is the type of reform that we need. I apologize for speaking so fast. Yes, thank you very much.
Next, we would like to invite Professor Kim Jong-chul of Yonsei University Law School. As I've been introduced, I'm Kim Jong-chul of Yonsei University. Well, the moderator is pressuring us to keep within the time constraint, and so I will jump right into my contents. Executive Director Yu spoke under the title of Anti-Corruption Realization of a Society that Upholds Integrity. He gave us a very objective view of the achievements of the Moon Jae-in administration. I agree with his statements, and I would just like to add to his presentations, and if needed, add some questions. What I would like to emphasize is that anti-corruption and a society that upholds integrity is indeed very important based on our constitution. And so I would like to approach this issue from this perspective. And I believe that in evaluating the anti-corruption policies of the Moon Jae-in administration, we should have a comprehensive view. I thought that I would be able to share my slides, but please refer to page 221 of the proceedings, and I have provided you with an overall flow. And the core of this is that the domestic and international environment is changing very quickly, and there is the request for decentralization and participatory democracy with the participation of the people. The Moon Jae-in administration has a 5-year term, and so in the 5 years, we cannot achieve all of these items on the agenda. But ultimately, we need to come up with a democratic society based on our constitution. And so in order to do that, we need good governance. And to put it narrowly, this would be to deal with corruption, to make sure that there is no taking and giving of bribery. But we should not stop at that narrow definition. We need to expand that goal to create a good society, a good nation with good governance. And so how do we achieve this larger goal? So anti-corruption is not solely about stopping specific people from becoming involved in corruption. We need to expand the meaning and make sure that the government proactively deals with achieving good governance. And so we need to make sure that we have a comprehensive approach to anti-corruption and a society upholding integrity. That is what I would like to emphasize. So, our concept of corruption should be expanded to creating a good society, and we should not be passive in our administration. Being passive may get rid of certain types of corruption, but it may not encourage good behavior that goes beyond stopping corruption. And if we take a look at the structure of our national agenda, there are 5 large sections that is made up of 100 items and about 400 tasks under those items. And number 2 out of the 100 items is related to anti-corruption. And within this structure, we can see that anti-corruption should have a comprehensive approach from a macro perspective. That is something that I would like to emphasize. Well, I can see time is passing by. If we take a look at the evaluation of the civic society presented by the speaker, we can see that there were many requests made by the civic society, and much of it was executed by the Moon Jae-in administration. I would like to emphasize that civic society should have a more in-depth understanding of a democratic republic. So we should not overly emphasize anti-corruption for the president. Of course, we did need anti-corruption measures, and the president surely conducted various anti-corruption measures. Of course, we need to do this. But if we overly emphasize anti-corruption, then that may actually lead to the voluntary activities for anti-corruption in the grassroots, and if we overly emphasize anti-corruption for the president, then we may actually only have top-down efforts. So this is something that I would like to emphasize at this point in time. I would also like to add that discussions related to the transfer of the Board of Audit and Inspection to the National Assembly, and I think discussion is much needed concerning this. This is linked with the constitutional revision, and the Board of Audit and Inspection should be made independent by transferring it to the National Assembly, but the relevant laws were not passed by the National Assembly. I think we need much discussion on this issue. Concerning the evaluations of the progress thus far, I agree with the presenter. I believe that the adoption of the Conflict of Interest Act is quite admirable. But I would like to mention that on March 23rd of 2021, before the passing of the Conflict of Interest Act, there was the enactment of the Basic Law for Public Administration. This is a law that will support the Conflict of Interest Act, and there are many systems that can supplement the Conflict of Interest Act through the Basic Act of Public Administration. And I believe that that was a very important piece of legislation. I have one more slide left, but because I used up all my time, I will stop here. And if I am given another opportunity, maybe I can mention this slide. Thank you. Thank you very much. Due to the time constraint, I will not summarize your statement. Next, we will invite Professor Vladimir Tikhonov of the University of Oslo. We had originally thought that he would participate online, but he is here with us in person. Professor Tikhonov, your statement, please. Thank you very much. Just like Professor Lee has mentioned, I am not a law expert, I am a historian, and so despite my limitations, I would like to speak from the perspective of a layman. As we have heard, internationally we have recognized that Korea's transparency was enhanced, and just like Executive Director Yu has mentioned, the Transparency International ranking fell to number 52 in 2016, but we have rose to number 33. But we have to take a look at what number 33 means. If we take a look at the per capita purchase power, Korea is ranked at number 36. And so the transparency ranking of 33 and the per capita purchase power of 36 is quite similar. And our transparency ranking is similar to Spain, Portugal, and the US. But if we compare ourselves to Japan, we can see that Japan's ranking is 19. And if we take a look at the highly transparent societies of Asia, for example, Singapore is at number 3 and Hong Kong is at number 11. So number 33, of course, it's a great achievement, but it still means that we have a far way to go. Especially if we compare ourselves to Japan, we need to remember that Japan has a single ruling party, and in Korea we have a very stable bipartisan society. And so textbook says that being bipartisan is very important in transparency. And so that fact alone shows that Korea's ranking should be higher than Japan, but Japan's ranking is much higher. And if we take a look at the evaluations of Transparency International, they actually reflect the scores of about a dozen organizations. And there are 2 organizations that gave Korea very low scores. One is Political and Economical Risk Consultancy and Economist Intelligence Unit. PREC concentrates on management activities. EUI focuses on swindling by public officials. And so those are the 2 areas where Korea has lower scores. So we can see that corporate activities and the public officials, they still have close ties, and that is still quite severe in the Korean society. Executive Director Yu, if you could elaborate on this topic, I think that would be very helpful. Executive Director Yu talked about the Conflict of Interest Act. Well, this law was tabled at the National Assembly. It was pending for a very long time. It was passed with the LA speculation incident. This act actually covers about 2 million public officials, and if we take a look at their family members, it covers about 5 to 6 million. That's 1/10 of the total population of Korea. So I would like to ask, since this law actually covers so many people, is it possible to register all of them as stakeholders? And what if they actually have transactions in the name of third parties? Is it systematically controllable? And also, I would like to talk about scandals. Well, corruption is not just a scandal, but it's very structural. Executive Director Yu made a very important point. Korea's speculations and scandals are elite scandals, elite group scandals. The bureaucrats, they actually have to go through the high-level exam for government officials. People usually study for this exam for 3 to 4 years, and so they actually want to be compensated for their efforts. So how are we going to compensate them as a society? I believe that we need to break the closed loop within the bureaucratic society and democratize the society in order to make sure that those who pass the high-level exam for government officials do not monopolize all of the power in the public sector. That will be very important for anti-corruption. I would like to ask Executive Director Yu how this would be possible. Thank you.
감사합니다.
Thank you very much. And next, I would like to invite from Chungnam National University Professor Ryu Dong-min. Yes, thank you. My name is Ryu Dong-min, and I would like to comment on Professor Kim Yoon-jung's presentation about the fair economy. It was a very informative presentation, and I am not also an expert in this field. And because there are other discussants, I would also like to talk about the issues that I think is important in terms of fair economy and provide you with the larger picture. So democratization of the market, that was part of the title of the presentation. And basically, I think that market and democracy are 2 separate things, or 2 independent things. So democratizing the market,
시장이 돌아가는 게임의 룰이라고 할까요?
I think that if you look at the rule of the game of the market, ensuring that the rule of the game is fair, guaranteeing the fairness, that would be the democratization of the market. And in the past, we talked a lot about the democratization of economy here in Korea. And I think that that is separate from, in many cases, the market. And based on my understanding, we talk a lot, and this was mentioned in the presentation as well, the inclusive growth. And there is an economist in the U.S., Acemoglu, and if you look at what he wrote about inclusive economic institutions, he emphasizes that private property is ensured, that individuals will exert creativity and work hard only when private property is guaranteed. And it says that that is when the inclusive economic institutions function well. Protecting the private property and democratization of the market and trying to make the market more fair through this. Well, I think that there can be contradictions based on the situations. For example, there can be distortion in the market. If you look at the past administrations, I think that all administrations talked about the democratization of the economy and regulating the conglomerates. But as you near the end of the administration's term, you can see that there are many problems raised, for example, the distortion of the economy, but at the same time, economic growth has to be promoted. And so a lot of these issues are not resolved and continues to repeat themselves in our economy. So I think that when we talk about fair competition, we have to look at it from a larger perspective, whether it's the democratization of the economy. I think that we have to look at this from a more general perspective. And if we look at the recent situation, I think that this has been dealt with a lot in the media. The young people in their 20s and 30s are quite sensitive about fairness. And also those with vested interests. The concept of fairness among the older generation with vested interests may be different from the concept of fairness in the minds of the young people. So this is my view. We talk about inclusive growth, but if you look at the individual economic agents, especially the young people, they seem to believe that there are some sectors that can be included in the inclusive growth. And then there are other sectors that are excluded from inclusive growth. And so the young people, they want to enter into the sector that can enjoy inclusive growth. And that seems like a major goal for these young people. And so there are some people who make it into the inclusive growth sectors and those who cannot. And I think that the young people are very sensitive and shows interest in entering into the sectors included in inclusive growth. And also, I said that democratization of the market, in my view, is about ensuring that the game of the rule is ensured in a fair manner. But I think that right now, there is only a focus on the fair rules within the sectors that are included in the inclusive growth only. For example, as you know, with the launch of the Moon Jae-in administration, the non-regular workers, they were given regular job positions. And those who have been given regular positions, even after that switch, still within the companies, these people, they see discrimination. And I think that some people still are dissatisfied about their status, even after they were given regular worker status. So I think that when we talk about fairness, we have to have a wider perspective and talk about it from a wider and general perspective. Thank you.
예, 마쳤습니까?
Yes, have you
Yeah,
finished?
감사합니다.
Yes, thank you very much.
다음에
So next,
이화령,
I would like to invite
KDI
Dr.
연구위원
Lee Hwa-ryung, who is a fellow at KDI. Yes, thank you very much. My name is Lee Hwa-ryung from KDI. And Dr. Kim Yoon-jung, she gave a presentation about the policy movements for building a fair society. And she talked about how there are many regulations that have been implemented. For example, those that can block the conglomerates for enjoying undue benefits, for example, and the changes to the required equity shares of the companies. But I think that there are still a lot of policy tasks that have to be dealt with. So let me talk about that. When it comes to inclusive growth, I think that the role of the FTC is expanding. So there has to be a change in the policy execution system accordingly. And also, there are some policy tasks that have to be dealt with as we're seeing the digital economy and the platform economy growing. And when it comes to concentration, well, we can talk about the market concentration, general concentration, and possession concentration. The market concentration is about the core duties of the authorities dealing with competition. But in the presentation, it was mentioned that the general concentration and the possession concentration also drops or leads to decline in the efficiency of the resource distribution. And so it also hurts the dynamics of the economy and can lead to damages of worsening market concentration as well. So the general concentration and also the possession concentration should also be included as being regulated by the fair trade policies. And also, if you look at other countries and the US and Europe, for example, there are new institutions, for example, the Antitrust Subcommittee of the US Congress that is focusing on the digital economy and the digital market and how there can be a distortion of the economic freedom and the political freedom of individuals. And also, there was a suggestion for platform regulations. Also, in Korea, well, we have been focusing our attention on regulating only the traditional conglomerates, but I think that we have to expand our focus to include regulations for digital conglomerates as well. And as it was mentioned in the presentation of Dr. Kim, well, the fair trade policies have been revised to strengthen the regulation of transactions and relations between the subcontractors and the contractors. And also there has been efforts to enhance the negotiation and negotiating power of the SMEs, for example. However, with the FTC playing a greater role, it might be very important or difficult actually for the FTC to play existing duties in an efficient and effective manner as the range of the duties continue to grow. So this might actually compromise the function of the FTC to ensure a fair competition. And so I think that there has to be collaboration between the FTC, the Korea Fair Trade Mediation Agency, and the KCA. And last but not least, also the unfair transactions and the platform business is something that is receiving a lot of attention these days with the rise of the digital economy. So with the existing competition rules and regulations, it will be difficult to tackle the unfair transactions in the platform economy and the digital economy. And therefore, I think that the FTC should come up with new laws that can deal with the online platform transactions, and I think that continuous interest has to be shed to improve the regulations in this area as well. Thank you very much. So thank you.
We only had a short amount of time, but 6 discussants have used 5 minutes each to effectively utilize the time available. I am sure that you had much more to share with us. We will go back to our 3 presenters, and we would like to ask them to comment for about 3 minutes each.
이구공 교수님.
We will go to Professor Lee Gu-won first.
Yes, let me reply. In terms of the republicanism, I think that already our society has taken a turn towards republicanism. There's a lot of interest in the public issues, and also in terms of the abuse of power, the citizens are very overly sensitive, and it has become a society where nobody can be free from the checks of the citizens when it comes to wrongdoing. So I think that we have grown and become more sophisticated in a sense, going towards republicanism, but I think that we need to further develop and advance this trend. Now, I do agree with separating the investigation with prosecution in a very consistent manner. I think that, however, we need time for the next 10 to 15 years. I think that we will be in a transition phase. So we need patience, and I did not have time to talk about the past scandal involving the previous president, but the judicial branch, I understand, has loosened trust among the people. In order to recover the trust for the judicial system, well, I think that there has to be self-efforts from the judicial side. Dr. Lee asked about meritocracy and commented on that. I fully agree with what she said. Now, in a free democratic society, there are people who have been elected into the positions that hold authority. But I do believe that the people will want to verify their qualifications, and I don't think that the citizens would agree to give them the ultimate decision-making rights. And so I think that even those in the middle range authoritative positions, well, they have to be involved, and also the citizens have to be involved. So there has to be participation of different people. But depending on the sectors and the fields, I think we have to think about what is a right system that is required. In terms of the judicialization of politics, I think that after World War II, under the influence of the U.S., many countries have pursued reform, including Germany and Korea as well. I think that we are at a position where it's difficult to simply mimic what exists in other countries, including the U.S. And so I think that Germany, likewise, Korea, we have to engage in creative measures, implement creative measures, and find what is right for our societies and our institutions. So I think that we should focus on developing what we already have, and I think that that would be sufficient. Yes, thank you very much. So let's go on to Mr. Yu.
Well, Professor Kim Jong-chul did not ask questions, but rather he stated his opinions, in particular concerning anti-corruption and creating a society that upholds integrity. He mentioned that it should be viewed from a macro perspective. And concerning the request of the civic society, the execution should not be overly centered on the president, but rather it should have a broader understanding of a democratic republic. And so I agree with your statement, and I will try to reflect your opinions in my work. Professor Tikhonov talked about 4 points, and first, compared to Japan, the Korean situation is a bipartisan system which enables the change of government, which should translate into a positive impact on transparency. But our ranking is still lower than Japan. I agree with your statement. Well, in particular, Koreans don't like to lose to Japan, and so we need to raise awareness on the fact that we are falling behind Japan in terms of our CPI index. And as you have mentioned, the evaluation of TI collects these scores from about a dozen organizations. And so they actually collect 13 different indexes, and 10 of those scores are reflected for Korea's CPI, and our scores from PERC and EIU are relatively lower. These scores are related to management activities and the relationship between politicians and the business. The late Chairman Lee Gun-hee of Samsung, he had once stated that the business is world-class, but politics is second-rate and public officials are third-rate. I don't know about the actual performance, but in terms of transparency, the government officials in Korea are not given very high evaluations. I believe that in terms of anti-corruption and transparency, the businesses need to be more focused on these aspects. This requires the voluntary activities of the businesses as well as cooperation. ESG management is currently in the limelight, and so ESG stands for environment, social, and governance, and so governance is related to transparency, and so that's because of the ESG management movement, more companies are becoming interested in governance, and so we look forward to businesses taking a leap forward in terms of their governance and transparency. Concerning the conflict of interest law, you mentioned that it covers 2 million people, up to 5 to 6 million people when we include family members and acquaintances. You mentioned, would it be possible to register all of them and manage all of them? Well, Conflict of Interest Act does not require the registration of all transactions, but it actually requires the registration of transactions that may actually cause conflict of interest. And so it is a law that sets the principle of making sure that there is no conflict of interest in conducting official work on the part of the government. And so I don't believe that there will be too much burden concerning the system. You also talked about how you need to make a great investment in order to become a high public official in Korea, which leads to corruption. Well, that may have been so in the past, but society is changing very quickly. Unfortunately, the most popular jobs in Korea are public officials. It's probably because of job security and pension. And so the people who have become selected as public officials, they are not willing to give up their job security in exchange for bribes. And so I don't believe that corruption will not disappear because of wanting to be compensated for their efforts that they have made. I think our society is changing, but nevertheless, we do need to continue to raise awareness and make sure that we reform the public official group. Thank you very much. Let's go to Dr. Kim Yoon-jang.
Yes, thank you very much. I thank the two discussants, which gave me a lot of food for thought. First of all, Dr. Yoo Dong-min, well, he talked about something that is very philosophical, and he mentioned about how it is time for us to look at issues that cannot be solved through simply democratizing the market. Well, the Competition Act, like you mentioned, is about building a rule for the market and ensure that there is fairness in the market. Well, there is a saying that the reason that capitalism was maintained was because of the Competition Acts. the laws. So the competition rules and the regulations have served as an important function for the maintenance of capitalism. But at the same time, we have to look at this from a larger perspective, because now I do believe that the economic order of Korea has stabilized somewhat. Now at our organization, we are working on a project regarding the law that supports the micro businesses, and we asked the owners of the micro businesses, do you want to work as a self-employed person or continue to operate a micro business? Don't you want to join a large corporation? And most of the people say no, they want to continue to work as micro workers because they, as it was mentioned, have an experience of being mistreated and also being discriminated within the large corporations in Korea. So as it was mentioned by the professor, I think that democratization within the companies is also important. And also Dr. Lee Hwa-ryung, she made some very important points, especially she mentioned about how the digital economy has grown and led to the birth of large corporations within the digital economy. And in the US, there is a package for regulating these digital companies. The Online Platform Act is now submitted to the National Assembly. I do agree that we have to swiftly pass this law. And last but not least, FTC plays a lot of different roles now, and now perhaps ensuring fairness of trade the work of the FTC to ensure this might be compromised. That was another comment that was made. So I do agree, and I think that a supplementary agency or cooperative partners have to be designated so that the FTC can work together with them to ensure fair trade. Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for keeping within your time limit. I think we can afford one more minute to each of the discussant if you wish to speak. For the discussants who wish to add to the conversation, we will give you one more minute. Well, Professor Kim Jong-chul mentioned that you would like more time, so we will turn the floor to you. Thank you very much. Well, the second part of my evaluation was not mentioned because of the time constraints, so I would like to actually present that slide. I did cover the main points of this. When pursuing anti-corruption policies, there are some structural limitations. I would like to mention these structural limitations. I mentioned that we need a comprehensive approach for anti-corruption policies. Because we went through a rapid period of democratization and liberalization, we had to find solutions for various issues at the same time. So on a micro level, there are many achievements, but there is still much to achieve. I think if we just take a look at just the shortages, then we may fall into despair. And so we need to make sure that we evaluate where we are at so that we could have a more positive view about our future and future tasks. Thank you very much.
Dr. Yeon-jo and Dr. Vladimir Tikhonov, do you have anything to say? Yes, well, I don't think I have anything else to add, but as I was summarizing, I think I hurried too much. The reform of institutions, I mentioned that the conclusion of one reform is actually the beginning of another reform. That was what I wanted to mention.
Well, I would like to add the following. The high-level exam for public officials is a system that other people envy, because this actually is a system that provides high-quality government officials. And some people say that Korea was able to develop quickly because of this system. But in terms of corruption, this system is not always a plus. It could be a minus. I think this is a long-term task for the Korean society. So we need to go beyond the mechanical merit system. And so we will need to have alternative systems to recruit high-level public officials. Well, thank you very much. Well, I looked to the floor to see who was paying the most attention. And I could see Dr. Yoon Tae-bum in the audience paying attention. Is there anything that you would like to add, Dr. Yoon? Yes, thank you. And we had an event to collect the opinions of the people. And we asked the people, what is a fair society? And if we take a look at some opinions, fair opportunities, a society without corruption, a fair society without monopoly, a society where people do not feel frustrated, a society where the public officials show justice as a model, a society where wealth and power is not inherited by their children, a society where those with power have all of the information, a society that enables us to live together are some of the answers that people gave to the question, what is a fair society? I think all of the answers are pointing to a similar direction. During the morning, we have heard very intense presentations and discussions, and I believe there is much food for thought. We took a look at the 4 years and 2 months of the Moon Jae-in administration, and we also took a look at what we need to continue to fill in the remainder of the term. We need to decentralize power, and we need to keep power in check. We need to make sure that there's transparency for decision-making, and that those should be the direction for institutional reforms. We also need to make sure that we have a system to keep each other in check. And I think from the perspective of the people, they don't feel like they were empowered to make decisions. Well, the people, they are not asking that the power is concentrated on the president or the public prosecutors. Well, we believe that what we need is to make sure that the power is with the people. And so I think we need to look back on these factors. Secondly, we talk about the elite cartel, and that is related to those who pass the high-level exam for public officials. We moved from military authority to political authority, and then when we actually kept this in check, that actually led to power that lasts for longer. Not the political power that lasts for just 4 to 5 years, but the power that lasts for a very long time, which are the bureaucrats who pass the high-level exam for public officials. So we start to focus on their power. And many of the presenters and discussants talked about this as the task at hand. And reforms sometimes will become something that falls behind if we are not careful. The Moon Jae-in administration continued their reforms throughout the last 4 years, but President Moon Jae-in actually participated in the reforms of the Nomuyon administration, and he mentioned that although the Nomuyon administration made great efforts, everything was turned upside down after the change of power, he mentioned. And the reform of the public prosecutors, it did not happen for just 4 years, but the 5 years of the Nomuyon administration with the 4 years of the Moon Jae-in administration, a total of 9 years. So our weaknesses is the fact that when there is a change of power every 4 to 5 years, then we have these vulnerabilities. And so what we need to do is to make sure that we work with a power that lasts for longer than 4 to 5 years. For example, the power of the media, the power of the businesses, and the power of those who pass the high-level exam for public officials. So the various policy programs that we have should deal with the longer-lasting power, those of the conglomerates, the media, and those possessed by those who pass the high-level exam for public officials. And so, I think we need to reread the presentations and discussions, and we can experience how heavy our tasks are for the way forward. And so I do hope that you will find time to reread the presentations and discussions, underlining every important point, and I'm sure that you will have great enlightenment and realizations. Well, we are talking about fairness, and so we need to be fair with our time. And so I tried to make a fair distribution of time amongst our presenters and discussants. And so it was a very great opportunity for us to gather together as a panel. Thank you very much for participating in session 3. Thank you very much. This brings us to the end of session 3. Please enjoy your lunch, and we will continue with session 4 and the roundtable discussion in the afternoon.